I am Carol Womack, and I am with Diversified Trust Company. I spent a great deal of my career at Vanderbilt University, worked with Greg there for a number of years, and headed up the private equity portion of our portfolio there at Vanderbilt. Now at Diversified Trust, we are a wealth management firm based in the Southeast with about $5 billion under management, 4 offices in Nashville, Atlanta, Memphis, and Greensboro. And we have a private equity fund of funds primarily for the benefit of our clients, not exclusively. But I head up that effort now, and our funds are diversified among venture capital, buyout, and opportunistic strategies. So if you guys would introduce yourselves, tell us a bit about yourself and about your firms. Get us started off.
Yep. Eric Keene from Council Capital. I've been working in private equity for the last 10 years, kind of across the gamut of private equity, from growth equity to late stage buyout. The last 10 years, 6 spent exclusively working on healthcare transactions. Prior to that, spent time working in Credit Suisse First Boston, did some management consulting work as well. Council Capital, some people in the audience may or may not know who we are. Well, we manage about $150 million, focusing exclusively on healthcare transactions, $5 million, $50 million in revenue. We play in a kind of unique part of the marketplace. We play after early stage venture and kind of below the competitive part of what I call the middle market buyout world. And the structure of our fund is really focused around high net worth individuals. Main Council Capital comes from our CEO Council, which is a pretty unique structure in that we have 26 former CEOs, presidents who generated $30 billion of shareholder value in those roles, who contribute 65% of our capital. So very operator oriented in the way we look at the marketplace. And we play, like I said, between early stage venture world, late stage buyout world. We're not taking business model risk or technology risk, and we're not playing in auctions to become almost a perfectly efficient marketplace. We take execution risk where we can leverage our CEO Council model and the 26 folks who live and drive in businesses. So that's us.
I'm Derek Dagnan. I'm a portfolio manager for the Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System. I spent about 8 years in equity research on the sell side, focused on healthcare companies, mainly on facilities, post-acute care, and I also followed distributors, labs, PBMs, and healthcare IT. In 2009, I found myself on the couch, and I was fortunate enough to join TCRS as a portfolio manager, and I managed a large cap healthcare portfolio. So I gained experience in biotech, pharma, med devices, managed care, and things like that. So a lot of regulatory experience and investing experience across healthcare. About a year ago, I was asked to start up a opportunistic, non-investment grade fixed income product. We focus on high yield bonds and loans and private credit, both domestically and internationally. It's mainly a LP-GP situation where we're investing in funds or creating separate accounts. So I sit on this alternative investment team along with Daniel Cruz, who manages our private equity business, and our real estate team. And so I move across those. We're kind of as a team. I take the lead on the debt, but anything that's in healthcare, I end up doing a lot of the due diligence on healthcare. TCRS is about a $40 billion pension fund. It's managed mainly in-house. We do use fund managers on private equity and then in my space, private credit.
Hi, good evening. I'm Teresa Sexton. I am a partner in the equity investment program at Claritas Capital. We are growth capital providers for technology platforms, business services companies, and healthcare companies, and sometimes where they all intersect. We'll provide $1 to $5 million of what we consider influential minority capital, and we can scale up to about $15 million. The 3 investment partners at Claritas are really generalists among the themes in which we're focused on, and in any given year we're looking at probably 100 plus deals to do 2 to 4 transactions.
Well, let me just set the stage, starting by talking just for a moment about Nashville, what a unique place it is for healthcare investing and healthcare services. And some of you, your locally probably know some of these statistics, but there are more than 300 healthcare companies based here in Nashville. 18 of those are publicly traded. Nashville the hospital management companies that are based here manage more than 60% of all the not-for-profit hospital beds in America. So that's pretty astounding if you think about it. Also, the companies that are headquartered here generate more than $70 billion of revenue and employ more than 400,000 people. So I've heard Nashville described as the Silicon Valley of healthcare. And as Eric and I were just talking before the meeting here about how, those of us who live here maybe get a sense of this, that it's, I think there's a unique, Nashville has always been known for the arts and music, but there's a unique sense of entrepreneurialism here that I think has sprung up from healthcare being as important as it is. And it's just a great place for healthcare investing. As we step back now and look more globally at the landscape, things are changing. It's an exciting time. There is innovation, there is regulation that's governing a lot of what we do. The IPO markets are red hot right now. So we've decided we want to not delve too deeply into the innards, if you will, of the regulatory environment, but we thought it would be interesting for you all to hear more about what the people here on the panel are seeing on the front line in terms of opportunities and the changing landscape. So we're going to take different segments. We're going to start out talking a bit about the notion of expansion of healthcare, the Affordable Care Act, and in a way how that impacts what our panelists are seeing on the front line, and at the same time what negatives may be coming from that as well. Let me set the stage also with just a couple of introductory comments about the IPO market for healthcare. Interestingly, for first quarter, last year was good as well, very strong, but for this quarter there were 64 IPOs in total, more than twice the number last year and the highest since 2000. Of that number, let's see, sorry, give me just a second here. Okay, 10, so of the total number here, 10 of those companies were venture-backed companies, so not all, but the venture-backed ones were in the IT space, and 24 were in life sciences. So we're seeing a real surge, if you will, in the activity for healthcare companies that are going public. So with that background, if you will, each panelist, if you'll let's talk first about the notion of expansion of healthcare as it pertains more to the regulatory environment with the Affordable Care Act, and how you see that changing the landscape in terms of both opportunities and changes that could be a negative or could be red flags.
Sure. Yeah, I think when you think about the marketplace, the way we broadly think about all this disruption is it affords a lot of interesting opportunities. As we think about the marketplace, we really think that what's going to happen going forward is there's going to be a shift in the way healthcare is provided, the provision of healthcare. Now, the duration of time and when that's going to happen is obviously in the air, where we're going to shift from a fee-for-service model on the provider side to some sort of value-based model. So there's going to be this emerging trend of payers moving towards providers, providers moving towards payers. So the way we look at the places we want to play from an investment perspective, it's really around what we call the right side of change. So we're not guys who are going to be the first dollars in, we're not going to be a Series A investor, but we want to invest in companies that are performing well, and they're going to do even better as cost constraints increase and as demand for outcomes, and actually quantifiable outcomes improves. We focus an overwhelming amount of our time around healthcare, IT, and services. And as we think about the services market, I think it's a market that's very much in flux right now, how people are thinking about healthcare services, at least again, in the private equity world. I think people are very hesitant about where they're going to put their money at now, because there is so much happening. People don't really know where the ultimate scheme is going to end up in terms of fee-for-service is going away, so how do you base a valuation? How do you think about that? I think a lot of people are being drawn more and more towards the healthcare IT part of the world, and some of the behavioral side, and some of the genomics, which I think Teresa can talk about more than I can. as you think about ways to take costs of the system, it seems as though the marketplace is going towards a world where their outcomes can be tracked, they can be quantified, you can track people through the system, and you can find ways to take costs out of the system along the way. That's where we see the marketplace going.
Well, I'm mainly experienced on the public equity side, so I don't have a really strong opinion on the startup side. And, you know, as far as TCRS goes, these are really my opinions about that at TCRS. But I would I would say, I think it's fascinating. You know, if you asked institutional investors or private equity investors 4 years ago, you know, what would be the impact of Affordable Care Act? And they would have said, oh, hospitals are going to be great, and healthcare IT is going to boom because of, you know, all the investments that are being made. What's really interesting about the hospital business is, yes, there's a great amount of growth coming in 2014, 2015. The problem is we didn't know off what base. And so the base of the growth in the general hospital market, you know, it did not really grow for several years. And so investors got really interested, and a lot of capital flowed into the hospital space. And then kind of wake up and say, okay, there's great growth, but the period from, let's say, 2008, 2009 to 2012, 2013, you know, those hospitals, they did not perform very well. So it's very interesting when you look at, you know, how regulation impacts companies and how they have to make serious adjustments to their business models and the projections of what investors want to see. And you can look at just the mid-cap healthcare facility space, and it dramatically underperformed the rest of healthcare for like the last 5 years. Healthcare IT is a pretty similar story. There's a lot of small IT companies that start up and grow, but as they gain mass, the whole idea of technology is that there's going to be a tipping point where there's going to be significant operating leverage in the model. But in healthcare IT, for these large companies, that really hasn't happened. There are a couple companies, like obviously Cerner and maybe Athena, but there are several mid-cap, small-cap, publicly traded healthcare IT companies that just haven't fulfilled the promise. The revenue is there, the orders are there, but the business models have essentially not kicked in. So we can talk about what the opportunity that regulation creates, but really you need to think about where the power is. And when you think about a hospital or a facility, you think, who's the major power player? And it's managed care. Managed care was influential in the formation of the Affordable Care Act. And managed care is really making out gangbusters compared to how hospitals have performed. And I think that even going forward, as hospitals enter a hyper-growth phase and we start to realize this growth, it's pretty difficult to say that it's going to be all at the expense of managed care. Usually there's an adversarial relationship between the two groups. And if hospitals are going to work, managed care is not going to work. And you know, that may begin to occur in 2014, 2015. But I think managed care is going to have a lot of power as the regulations continue to evolve and change.
And just one quick follow-up question before we move on to Teresa. As we talked earlier, Derek, you made an interesting point about, okay, we can talk about models being changed and what opportunities there are, but also models that are impaired. If you could talk for a moment, I know you had some insights about that as well.
Sure, a perfect example of models that have been impaired by the Affordable Care Act. Home health is a model. Home health was a phenomenal investment in the late 90s, all the way up through 2009, really. Even through the crisis, home health was a great investment in post-acute care space. And essentially what happened was home health, you know, transitioned from a primarily non-profit business back in the 80s to a business that was dominated by for-profit companies, a lot of small businesses, small nonprofits and small for-profits, you know, ended up being rolled up into, you know, 3 or 4 larger for-profit, publicly traded companies. These are all small cap companies, by the way. But once the business was dominated by for-profits, Medicare Payment Advisory Act Commission came out with a series of recommendations over multiple years, asking for cuts in home health funding, and eventually CMS listened, and home health went through a series of multi-year cuts, and it pretty much destroyed the stocks, destroyed the business. These companies are still alive and viable, but they're struggling. Long-term acute care hospital is another excellent example where there's hyper growth in this post-acute care business in the beginning, primarily like 2002 to 2007. Profit margin got too high, and then regulations changed. CMS started changing regulations. The Affordable Care Act decided to cut the funding for Medicare, and that business has been in trouble. And then skilled nursing, the same question, the same situation.
Teresa, what do you see on the horizon?
I love Obamacare. I didn't think I was going to, but I do. It has really created tremendous opportunity for a lot of our portfolio companies. So, who would have thought that just an open enrollment kind of enabling SaaS technology company would, have the kind of multiples that Benefit Focus has? Who would have thought that patient engagement, in a holistic approach like what Sharecare is doing is going to be so meaningful to the payers? I think what's really interesting is what you said, Derek, is if you know who's sort of driving some of this change and your technology can address that, I think that we can all be winners. And you've mentioned Cerner and whether it's Cerner, eClinicalWorks, all these big enabling EMR systems. We're not an investor there, but we're an investor in a type of niche kind of technology that really enables a physician to utilize those systems without breaking a stride in their workflow. So I think to me there's a lot of it's been great, and we've had some good success with companies that are really taking advantage of the momentum in the market. In terms of whether it's through recapitalization, there's a lot of capital. I think if you have a company that has a very strong growth proposition, you should be able to get capital for it, and you got a strong team, and that's a really unique market. And I think it has a lot to do with how disruptive this is right now.
Let's step on that and start back with you, Teresa, talking a bit about capital formation and capital sources and where you see the sources of capital for these various kinds of opportunities.
Yeah, that's a great question because our capital base primarily high net worth individuals and family offices. And what I've realized is that family offices are in and among themselves. They're trying to become their own private equity kind of fiefdoms. They want to go into deals just like the smaller VCs used to do maybe in the 80s and the 90s. They have meaningful capital. They want to put it to work. They're deal driven. They love deals. So I think that's a really interesting. And they don't mind acquiescing to the experienced capital providers sitting at the table. So if you've got an institutional investor and they're bringing alongside some family office money, that might be beneficial for the company because you got a board that's not so dysfunctional. When you have multiple capital providers and they have different runways and different kind of objectives, it can get a little challenging for the portfolio company to manage through all the different types of timelines and initiatives that we all have internally. So that's been a really unique source of capital for companies. I think it's really also what Eric says about the strategic capital that comes to bear. I mean, that is valuable capital. So we're telling our clients or any kind of deals that we're seeing, just be mindful of the kind of capital that you want. Do you want minority capital? Do you want majority capital? Do you want high maintenance capital? And you need to be smart enough to be able to identify what those are.
Eric, back to you, and let me add a little bit of a twist or expansion as you to respond about the idea of capital intensity and subsectors that may be going in and out of favor because they require more or less capital. Because I saw some interesting statistics about the amount of capital going into pharma and biotech deals going down significantly. Let's see, it went from 48% to 33% between 2004 and 2012. I think, again, historically so incredibly capital intensive, whereas the services sectors and supplies and also healthcare technology has seen increases. So if you will, sort of interplay with your answer there about, the idea of capital intensity and perhaps those historically capital intensive sectors being somewhat out of favor now.
Yeah, I mean, I think those kind of markets, generally speaking, the capital intensive markets are obviously challenging for private investors. When you think about you're managing money and how controllable is that burn, it's hard to begin an investment that has uncontrolled burn and it needs CapEx. That marketplace is just challenging for early stage investors. And then later stage investors, you think about how they view the marketplace. They're looking for cash flow as well. As these companies progress, and again, we play in the kind of growth stage, but as you see assets that have a little bit of scale, the credit markets right now are outlandishly hot for buyout transactions. To the point where we're seeing transactions where people are putting 7 times senior leverage on transactions, which is it's like the go-go days of 2008 again for a lot of these middle market healthcare transactions doing scale. So I think when you think about capital intensity, and especially when you look at like the pharma world, I think pharma world is even more complicated when you think about it in the context of where innovation's going to come from. We've come about as far as they can go in a lot of ways with the molecule. So chemical-based pharmaceuticals are not really, there's not much innovation happening there. It's all around the biologicals, how you're innovating using living organisms, which is really complicated science. So when you think about inflows of fresh capital, it's hard for people like Teresa or I to get comfortable with putting a lot of money into science. That's a tougher place than just tweaking a business model, but actually baking on science and innovation to drive the businesses. That's a tough place for private capital.
So, sure. So, what I see is that obviously there's plenty of credit available to small companies, and obviously the large companies, and investors have a strong appetite for that. LPs have a strong appetite to provide that credit to GPs. And when you look at pharma and biotech, there are several different ways to finance your growth, and several different ways to fund innovation. So, 10 years ago, the healthcare royalty business was, small, and now there's, GPs raising large funds. There are large GPs that are regularly doing healthcare royalties as part of their funds. It's become, a pretty mainstream financing vehicle, and it really helps unlock a company's innovation potential. There are private equity firms that focus on entering into relationships with large pharma companies, and basically knowing that a large pharma company probably has, we'll say 15 viable drugs, pharma or biotech, 15 viable options in their pipeline, but they really only have the money to fund 3 blockbusters that they think are going to be blockbusters. And so these highly specialized, highly skilled, technically focused firms can go in and target 1 or 2 drugs and create, essentially pull that drug out and create a funding mechanism to take that drug through the process. And that's something that wasn't happening 10 years ago. And it really is driving innovation. I agree with what Eric said about the molecules come as far as it's going to go. But what has changed in the last 10 years is not only the technology inside the biotech firm, but outside in life sciences in general. The testing, the technology and testing, that's genetic testing and understanding how a drug interacts with patients that have certain gene markers. One thing that's really interesting in cancer, let's take breast cancer, it's a large disease base, but now you can take a relatively ineffective drug that's the standard of care, and Pfizer is working to essentially break breast cancer down into 10 different diseases based on gene markers. They will create a targeted drug for patients that have a certain gene marker, and then they will say, okay, what's incredible is they'll say, all right, this patient population is only 5% of the breast cancer potential patients, and so now we are an orphan disease. And so now Pfizer can charge an exorbitant price for their drug. And so the total spend on breast cancer increases as you start breaking it down into smaller diseases that are, obtain this orphan status from the FDA. And it makes it more, obviously now Pfizer can go out and spend the money and fund the innovation to bring the drug to market. So that's an example of how funding sources and the willingness to fund innovation is changing.
So, and I should have mentioned earlier, we're gonna have about 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if you wanna make mental notes about the questions, we'll have time for that at the end. Derek, since you broached the subject of genomics, and we've got a couple of other sort of big topics we'll talk about, but to me, genomics is really the most exciting because I think it brings so much potential efficiency in drug delivery and healthcare service delivery targeted to individual genetics, that we now have the ability to ascertain so much more economically than we did just a few short years ago. Teresa, I'm going to start out with you because I know that Claritas has made a recent investment in the genomic space, and so if you will talk about maybe that one and specifically, or just what you see sort of big picture and opportunities.
Yes. You'll have to stop me if I start bragging like it's my favorite child, because we just did close this investment about 14 days ago. So the company's Genomind, and what was so exciting to me was the fact that the standard of care for mental health is really like a Russian roulette. If somebody has a behavioral health situation, you're going to go to the clinician and they're going to start you on an antidepressant, not knowing anything about your chemical makeup, not knowing anything about your genetics, and then you're going to go through that, show up, you're going to have the side effects. You might have weight gain, you might have insomnia, you might have a lot of these different things, and so then you go back 2 months later and then they put you on another script, or they increase the dosage. And so what was so interesting is that, the answers are within us. The answers are in our DNA. There are biomarkers that can indicate that there can be a targeted approach to treatment, and in the long run, the payers are going to love it because it's going to drive efficiencies in the market. So to me, that was what was so exciting about Genomind, is that 15,000 patients have used the test. There's been measurable outcomes in terms of getting better faster. And at the end of the day, you can say right now we did an open label study, and it's saying, you can save on average about $2,000 in healthcare dollars. That is so underrepresented. You change your life. If you have a mental illness and you can't function, or you're sleeping 15 hours a day, and you lost your job, and your family's falling apart, or you get kicked out of school, that's a mental health situation that is beyond a $2,000 savings. That's, you have a largely disrupted life. And so what we can do with genetic testing is to go in and say, you have this gene variant that basically says it doesn't matter what antidepressant I put you on, nothing will ever work, ever, because your gene says so. So why don't we try this? Why don't we tailor it to this? Maybe it's a deficiency of a methylfolate, which is like a food group. Maybe it's something that is, where we can treat it without, without prescriptions. And so I think that is really exciting to me. In terms of taking the risk on the science, we did not. It was just like Eric says, we're chickens. So we had an investor that had really funded the founding of the company, the R&D, the commercialization, and then once there was a proof of concept and the test was being sold and the clinicians were starting to talk about it, there was some support with the APA, then we came in, and really our capital is to say, look, this capital is to build this workforce, is to put feet on the street, is to grow distribution partners, is to, really do what we do. It's, the behind the scenes type of activity. So that gets me me really excited, and that's just one tiny, teeny part of what Derek said, because I have to give him credit, targeted therapies. So targeted therapies, you're gonna see this, but you're gonna see it along a broad range of whether it's breast cancer, whether it's mental illness, whether it's, could be autism or Alzheimer's or schizophrenia, whatever it is. But targeted therapies, I think, are really attracting a lot of capital because people are understanding the chemistry is there. It's not your character, it's your chemistry, and we can get the answers.
It also, I think, means big changes for pharma companies because of the days that we thought about the big pharma and the blockbuster drugs, and it goes public and there's, $1 billion market cap. But now, maybe that's 10 successful drugs that are known to be successful on a certain population, so it's 10, $100 million IPOs rather than $1 billion. But here,
Yeah, and I think if you think about the way that marketplace is going to work, I think the way that, frankly, diagnosis is done, period, is going to be different. Because the attributes of historically we call breast cancer, and colon cancer. But at a genetic biomarker basis, what you're finding is a lot of it is the same. So they're going to start calling it, you're going to start treating based on the biomarker and the genetic disposition of the treatment rather than the location of the treatment, which I think is going to be really interesting as you think about the way that innovation with the delivery and care for people with specific conditions.
The other thing that's really important is, this is all prospective work that Teresa's talking about, but really you can do some retrospective. You can look at drugs that may not have worked very well or may have failed, and you can say, well, if we identify the population better and run a small clinical trial on a defined population, we may end up having a drug. So you can take like a mothballed product and turn it into something.
all right, good stuff. Let's go from there to the idea of medicine being digitized. And this, of course, comes more into play into healthcare IT technology. But one of the very interesting examples that was relayed to me by one of our venture capitalists in Silicon Valley was he was talking about, because now as data, medical data, patient data is being digitized, we can now see, we have the data and we can now find relationships in the data that we were never able to see before. And the, I thought, fascinating example he gave was that there was an antidepressant, I have no idea which one it was, but it was pulled from the market in the 70s and 80s because it was not effective for depression. But as they have now looked at historical data, they saw a correlation that many cancer patients were given as antidepressants because, not surprisingly, people with cancer are often depressed. And they found that the drug was effective in treating cancer. So they would have not ever known that, without, again, the digitization of all this data and being able to now much more easily find those associations in the data. So that's just an example to get everybody talking and thinking. But let's start with you. Let's see, we'll start with Eric here on Zoom. Just what you're seeing in that space. Does that have a lot to do with what you guys are you making investments in that space?
Yeah, I think at a macro level, yeah, I think obviously I think if you think about the big buzzwords, right, it's interoperability, it's big data, it's how you use information to determine outcomes and then generate products that can derive effective outcomes from a payer perspective and from a provider perspective. Because again, my general thesis in healthcare is it's all going to melt together. So yeah, I think the way to manipulate data and think about data is where the future is going. And I think it's going to be driven, again, by this whole notion of how do you drive outcomes and you move from a fee-for-service world to a value world where people are getting better at a cheaper price. So I think it's all how you manipulate it. And we're looking at a lot of opportunities in and around that space. Still pretty emerging in terms of what the technology is going to look like. So again, where we play, a lot of that's a little earlier than where we're going to go. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunity budding up around this space.
I think Eric's correct, but I think it's a long-term change. I think what's really interesting is that the established players in the hospital world or in the managed care world or the drug distributor work, they have tons of data. They had tons of data. They've had it for years. And when a stock always starts going south, one of the first things they start talking about is, oh, we have all this data. We're going to do this project with all the data we have. We're going to take this data, we're going to create a business that tells everybody what they should do based on all this data. Well, that's been an investment thesis that has been doled out to investors from every company that has all this data, which is a lot of companies, and it rarely works. So it's going to take innovation, I think, at a smaller level. I mean, you can look at Healthways, right? Healthways, based here in Nashville, it's been not a success story. Let's see, and they have a lot of data. They have access to a lot of data, and it's really not a success story. They've had that data for a long time. So I think you're right. But I think it takes a long time, and I think it's going to take a new company, or maybe like the advisory board is a good example. Somebody that uses data well and gets tied in with companies like HCA to analyze their data. But then you have to do something with it. HCA has to be willing to change. Community has to be willing to change, and that's just not really clear. I mean, if you look at accountable care organizations, there are a lot of focus on accountable care organizations around Phoenix and around select markets, but none of these larger companies are really funding the development of accountable care organizations. And that's a situation that is where you think it's headed, right?
Yeah, I think it is. I think good. But I'm not. The duration time is obviously a question. So in the short term, it's how do you take cost out of the system? So I think that's, and to your point about health, that's an interesting thing, because they're almost a case study of how the pricing methodology skews the way people view the business. So when we're getting paid a fee for, again, that's a fee for service model, fee for member model, versus all these players who've been in the wellness marketplace, which is a hot space, population management, population health, and all these other buzzwords, is they've never really been able to price their business model off of a return on investment, right? So they can never say, oh, we're going to take a percent of your profit share. Which to me, that whole model, and a lot of them like that, don't work until you start getting to that point. People aren't going to really use it until you can start saying, I'm going to get paid in a different way.
Teresa?
Data. There's been a lot of very big companies that have generated a lot of enterprise value and a lot of wealth on data, whether it's Facebook, having the data for your personal profile, LinkedIn having the data for your business profile. We invested in a company that wants to hold all your data for your healthcare profile. And what we think is important is that we actually all own our own healthcare data. And I think if you can do that, and then you can, coupled with your payer, maybe your payer acting as more like your air traffic controller, telling you where you can go get the best delivery of care in the most efficient way and in the most cost-effective way. I think that that's helpful if the data is mobile. Healthcare's never been accused of being fast-moving industry, ever. So you're absolutely right. We'll probably be talking about this in 25 years from now. But if you can figure out those platforms that can take those really critical pieces of data, and then they can figure out, how can you use this data to engage with a clinician through your mobile app? How do you use this data by creating your own personal medical, encounter on your desktop? If you have, a certain situation, how do you drive, efficient models that way? Can you really take costs out of the system by doing that? I think we're all trying to figure that out. But I think at the end of the day, it's the company that has a holistic approach to bringing payers and patients and providers together that's going to win.
Let's make this the final question, and we'll have time for questions from the audience. Let's talk a bit about the trade-off, if there is one, between innovation being about better efficacy for the patient, better quality of life, some of the issues we talked about with genomics, or, in contrast, best world, maybe both, but cutting costs. Because it seems like at a sort of national debate level, we realize the need to cut costs, but we just have not, there's been a lot more innovation perhaps than efficient cost cutting. I know that now healthcare is about roughly 17% of GDP. It was 13% only a few short years ago. I saw something that predicted it would rise to 22% within the next 20 years. So, and what you all see on the front lines and the things that you get most excited about, do you see companies that are doing both? They're able to deliver better care, better quality of life for patients at reduced cost. How do you, hopefully it's both, but how do you look at that? And I'll give you time to think for just a second and give one quick example of a company that's in our portfolio called Theranos. And it does do both, I think, very, very well. The thesis of the company is to deliver within 5 miles of everybody's home, to deliver quality lab services in a much shorter time at a reduced cost. So the company's called Theranos. They're in Walgreens now. You can get a finger prick, so just a few drops of blood instead of the big vial. You can get results within hours instead of within days, and it costs about half of what the typical, if you look at the Medicare reimbursement cost for lab work, it's about half that. So it's a win, on every angle. But what do you all see in those trade-offs, or you see companies that are accomplishing both?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, the home run's the one that can do both. Now, the question is ultimately, as Derek mentioned earlier, who's paying for it and what business models can form around who's paying for the service. Short term, I think obviously innovation long term will win. I think in the short term in marketplace kind of opportunities we look at, we probably look at opportunities that can take cost out before we're going to look at a really innovative business. Because short term, when people, again, the world is in chaos, especially the provider world, thinking about what's going to happen, how is the world going to change. Any way you can have a demonstrative cost reduction, I think short term for the providers or for the payers, we're in the same boat. I think that's at least what if I was going to make an investment in an innovation or cost reduction, I would probably think cost reduction 9 times out of 10.
Okay. Teresa, we'll skip over to you.
Gosh, you make a good point. If you were to have $1, where would you spend it? So, I'm greedy, I want both. So in terms of the types of deals that we're looking at, we want to, on the healthcare and the business services side, we're trying to figure out, people are having to do business a different way. So we're trying to just look at enabling technologies, and that does get to, part of that's innovation, but we're justifying it with, it's taking cost out from the user that's actually having to, maybe if they are pushed to adhere to a regulatory, meaningful use. So we have to be a little innovative in the type of technologies we can bring to market to say, look, you have to, have these compliant, you have to comply, you have this regulation now, how can we enable you to continue to do what you're doing, maintain the margins that you need to maintain, how can we, prevent any bottlenecks in your delivery of care. And so we do try to bring a little bit of an innovation to support that, to support that cost reduction. So, but I guess you're right. If you had two that you're sitting there, if you had $1 and you had 2 deals, you'd go to the cost reduction first, because if it's already justified, then it's a much easier sell than the C-suite.
Somebody sell product.
Eric, what do you say?
I don't think that there's a lot of opportunity to find an investment that delivers both cost reduction and innovation. What's going on in pharma and biotech is the innovation is driving up the cost of care. So the real question in that space is, is the increased cost worth the improved outcome? So that's more of a relative value discussion. In areas like medical devices, most of the innovation is kind of taking baby steps, and so there's not a significant ramp up in innovation. And the true driver of the innovation behind the companies is getting a next generation product out there that they can push in a price increase, because they've been under so much pricing pressure for the last 5-6 years. So I think it may occur in your space. I think some of the areas you've discussed, but I think it's really the real question is relative value. The costs are going higher, but are you getting more value?
start with questions. Yes, you bet.
I'd like to ask Eric or the other panelists a real basic question. I've often wondered about, I've heard about these costs of these very specialized orphan drugs, and $100,000 a pill or something like that, or cost of treatment is $1 million a year. How does anybody, you know, sort of like, you know, an old fairy tale where I've got a secret elixir, now I'll give it to you, but you gotta give me everything you own and everything your parents own and your whole extended family. You know, or otherwise you can just die. But how is this, what is the payment for an orphan drug? If the drug is labeled orphan, how do the payers look at it? And who in the world can afford it besides some Arabian oil baron?
Okay, so I would say I shared your skepticism for several years, frankly. That at some point that someone's gonna knock on the door and say, hey, we've gotta have a discussion about the cost of these drugs, okay? So in Europe, they've had that discussion. England, NICE, I think, is the regulator in England. You know, they routinely knock down the price that they're willing to pay for orphan drugs, okay? In the U.S., we haven't had the discussion, and it's unlikely that we will, because managed care is the payer, right? In England, the government's the payer. In France, the government's the payer. So there are price controls in Europe. So if you're a drug manufacturer, you know, you're developing a drug to sell in the United States, and then you're going to sell it elsewhere, you know, but you're going to make all your money back for the cost of your innovation in the United States. Managed care will pay for these expensive drugs. Managed care in the U.S. has not pushed back on, in any significant way, on any of the cost of these drugs. The orphan drugs, they're absorbed, you know, the cost is very high, maybe $100,000 a year or $500,000 a year or something like that. But you're talking about those costs that you're talking about, like $200,000 a year on a drug. That's for what's called ultra orphan. There may only be 2,000 patients in the U.S. or 5,000 patients. For managed care, they'll write that check. It's okay. It's not a big dollar amount in the grand scheme of things. It gets a little more, when you get into drugs that barely make orphan status and you charge a lot of money, then it kind of gets into a hairy area for managed care, but they haven't pushed back yet. And I think what you've seen this year is you've seen Express Scripts and CVS and maybe some of the drug distributors push back a little bit on the costs associated with some of these newer drugs. But they're not orphan drugs. They're pushing back on Gilead's hepatitis C drug because it's a large market, and Gilead has this drug that cures hepatitis C. It's a pretty amazing drug. And yes, I think it was today or maybe yesterday they reported earnings, and they had it was like the first full quarter, maybe the second full quarter of having the drug on the market, at $2.7 billion in revenue. Okay, so this thing is a plus $10 billion run rate drug, and they bought the drug for $11 billion 3 years ago. Okay, the market, the hepatitis C market was a revenue, the annual revenue of hepatitis C was maybe $6 billion. Now it's going to be $11 billion because they're charging $1,000 a pill, $84,000 for the treatment. So I understand your concern, but I really, as an investor, I wouldn't worry about it too much right now.
Does Medicare and Medicaid pay the same as the other?
They pay discounted rates, but it's not, yeah, it's less, but they pay. Medicaid is paying, you know, most patients that have hepatitis, not most. There's a significant correlation between Medicaid patients and hepatitis C. And so, you know, a lot of the people that are taking this Gilead drug are Medicaid patients. I don't recall what the Medicaid rate is. It's less than $84,000 a year, but it's not half.
I'd like to know whether you all are bullish or bearish on the insurance industry. That seems to be the big elephant in the room. Nobody, you know, there are obviously all the innovation of payments. Everything else has to be dealt with risk management and all of those sorts of things. Insurance companies have obviously had a strong lobby in Washington, as we can see with the Affordable Care Act. What's your view on that, and how do you justify your views on your own portfolios with the healthcare things that you're involved with? How do you reconcile that with your view of the insurance, of how you view the insurance company?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I thought about the insurance marketplace broadly, I'm gonna bifurcate that question. One, the insurance marketplace, I still think it's wait and see there. I don't know if I'd say I'm long or short on that yet, because I think my distinguished panelists over here made a good point. Nothing happens very quickly in terms of how things are going to evolve. I think this is going to drag out for a long period of time, and I wouldn't probably go long or short. I probably wouldn't touch the space candidly myself right now, but I don't. That doesn't mean that's not a good long-term investment. From a portfolio perspective, one of the great things about healthcare broadly is people get old, people get sick. And if you look at the demographic, we'll go back to the graying of America everybody always talks about, right? There are demographic trends. 10,000 baby boomers a day turn 65. Average, once you hit 65, people are living 19.1 years beyond the age of 65, when that was 10 years ago, right? And the cost to take care of those people, 85 and plus, is $25,000 per capita versus it's $2,500 between 18 to 28-year-olds. So you start talking about the magnitude of dollars. Someone's going to pay for these services. It's just a matter of what the rates may change, the volume is going to go up, and it's going to keep going. So as you think about healthcare, it's just a steady marketplace long term. So when we think about our companies, I'm not that concerned about who the payer is, because it's going to get paid for somehow. Now the rates may come down, but broadly, I'm not that concerned that there's going to be paid for this.
I would say for insurance companies, under the current paradigm, the current regulatory scheme, bigger is better. So if you're focused on smaller deals, and you have a guy that comes to you and pitches you a unique insurance product, I would just make the assumption that the guy can get priced out of the market. So that gives the insurance companies, the balance of power shifts towards them in any sort of discussion with them about.
I think that, I can't pretend to tell you whether to buy insurance stocks or not. But are we bullish about opportunities that we may have in our portfolio because payers are looking at strategies from, whether it's from a capital investment point of view? We sort of are. I think that that the pain point, with the expansion of care, getting back to the mental health, before you have a plan and you get 10 visits to the, for your behavioral health a year, maybe 6, whatever is in your Blue Cross plan or whatever. But now with the mental health parity, it's got to be treated like any other, illness. And so it might not hurt yet, but I think when people start using it and they recognize the costs that are associated with that, they'll probably start looking at, they'll look at opportunities to have good favorable reimbursement for technology and innovation that might, make the delivery care a little more efficient. So, that's my bet anyway. That's our bet. That was our recent bet. So, bullish, cautiously.
Panel consensus is that it's a shift to a value model. As an investor, that tells me that price points and revenues potentially be affected directly. What incentive does the market have to do that? Cost reduction is great. I don't look at it as a value play. I look at that as improved efficiency. In an inefficient market, there's more opportunity to make return on costs. So what incentive does the market as a whole have to move towards the value market? Some counterintuitive.
Yeah, there is no real incentive yet, right? expensive hospital in the Nashville area, right? And so, let's say like an HCA hospital south of town, they can kind of start cutting costs a little bit with their managed. They're not going to be able to have the same pricing power of managed care as Vanderbilt does. And so, for instance, the managed care company is going to make more money off of Stonecrest than it is off Vanderbilt. So there is no real incentive. It's just who has the power. And so one thing you can think about things that shift power is several years ago, or 5 years ago, physicians had the power on deciding what they're going to buy from and use for medical devices in cardio or orthopedics. That power has shifted from the physicians to the hospital. And so with that shift, that means the GPO, the group purchasing organization, comes into the hospital and says, okay, I've got a deal for you. We're going to band all these hospitals together. And now we no longer have to deal with squealing doctors saying, I don't want to use that device. And the doctors have basically relinquished power, and so cost has been pushed down dramatically in medical devices. So that has become a profit center for a hospital, or a source of profit for a hospital. And the problem is the economy hasn't grown enough, there hasn't been enough procedural, like surgical procedures within this hospital for them to fully capitalize on. That's an example where managed care was certainly, I'm not managed care, sorry, medical devices certainly are ortho, cardio, and that should have been a huge benefit to hospitals.
I think it's going to have to come ultimately from the employers/payer, right? So if you think about, I guess I think more broadly about that question is sort of, if you think about the share of healthcare costs being borne by the individual, right? Everyone sees their high deductible plans go up every year. So healthcare consumers are ultimately getting smarter. In the past, we just went and my employer covered 100%. I don't care what I spend. As those ratchet up, at some point there's going to be an inflection point where the consumer is going to demand that value. Now again, to your point, I don't think it's going to happen for a long time, but that's where I think it's ultimately going to have to change the system. It's not going to come from the payer per se. It's going to come from the payer or the providers per se. It'll come from the payers in that the employers are also changing the plans for individuals. And the individuals are also going to say, well, my deductible is X. I want to have some transparency on price. Transparency on price by facility, how good the doctor is. I mean, I have an example. My wife is pregnant. And, we had a diagnostic test the other day. We don't usually do tests because we're having daily respective. And we get the bill. Tacitly decided to do the test. $1,200 diagnostic. It's like ordering from a menu and not having any prices. So as you think about the consumer and where that cost is going to have to come out, it's going to have to be that consumer who decides, I want to have some say, understand what I'm buying, and make it into some sort of rational economic environment for eventually. And I don't know when that inflection point is going to be. And that's where there's a lot of healthcare venture capital money going into that space around consumerism and price transparency. But I think that's ultimately what's going to be.
I agree. I have nothing else to add. Eric and Derek are very smart.
Anybody else, any other questions? All right, well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also wanted to thank the corporate sponsors. The bar is still open, and you can mosey out in the courtyard and enjoy the nice weather outside.
And there's a flag